Before the black banners appeared in Khorasan, the Muslim world was ruled by another dynasty, the Umayyads. For almost 90 years, their Caliphs ruled from Damascus, and during that time, the Islamic world expanded at an extraordinary speed. Westward, Muslim armies crossed North Africa and entered the Iberian Peninsula. Eastward, they pushed through Persia and deep into Central Asia. By the early 8th century, the Umayyad Caliphate stretched across thousands of kilometers, from lands near the Atlantic Ocean to the frontiers of India and China. It was one of the largest empires on earth. But ruling a vast empire was very different from conquering one. Inside its borders lived Arabs, Persians, Berbers, Syrians, Egyptians, Turks, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and millions of Muslims whose families had never come from Arabia. They spoke different languages, they followed different traditions, and many remembered a time before Damascus ruled them. As the empire grew, so did its divisions. Arab tribes competed with one another for military positions and political influence. Governors fought to maintain control over distant provinces. Some Muslim converts of non-Arab background resented inequalities that survived in parts of the empire, and supporters of the Prophet Muhammad's family believed that political leadership had gone in the wrong direction. The Umayyads still possessed armies. They still possessed enormous territory, and from the outside, the dynasty appeared powerful. But beneath that power were groups who wanted change. The problem was that they did not all want the same change. Some wanted a different ruler. Some wanted a different dynasty. Some believed a descendant of Ali should lead the Muslim community. Others were simply tired of distant governors and old tribal rivalries. For years, these frustrations remained divided. Then one family discovered how to bring many of them beneath a single movement. The Abbasids. Their name came from Al-Abbas ibn Abd al-Muttalib, an uncle of the Prophet Muhammad. Through Al-Abbas, the family belonged to Banu Hashim, the wider clan of the Prophet. That connection was enormously valuable, but the Abbasids did not begin by marching armies through the streets. They began quietly. Messengers traveled between towns. Letters moved from one supporter to another. Trusted representatives entered distant communities. And gradually, a political network began spreading through the eastern provinces of the Caliphate. The Abbasid movement was careful with its message. Instead of immediately declaring exactly which man should become caliph, its agents called people toward a chosen leader from the Prophet's family. The wording was broad enough that different groups could hear what they wanted to hear. And that ambiguity helped the movement grow. But a secret network could not overthrow an empire by itself. The Abbasids needed soldiers. They needed distance from Damascus. And above all, they needed a place where resentment was already strong enough to become rebellion. They found it in the east, in Khorasan. Khorasan was enormous. It included territory across what is now northeastern Iran, Afghanistan, and parts of Central Asia. It was far from the Umayyad capital, and it stood on the frontier of the Islamic world. Arab settlers lived beside large Persian populations. Old tribal rivalries remained powerful. Local politics were complicated, and the authority of Damascus felt very far away. For the Abbasids, that made Khorasan almost perfect. Years of preparation had already created supporters there, but the movement still needed someone who could transform those supporters into a disciplined revolutionary force. That man would become one of the most mysterious figures of the entire Abbasid story, Abu Muslim al-Khurasani. Even medieval historians disagreed about exactly where Abu Muslim came from. His early life remains uncertain. His ancestry was debated. Even reports about his original name conflict with one another. But whatever his beginnings were, his rise was extraordinary. He was young, politically gifted, and apparently capable of dealing with groups that had spent years fighting among themselves. The Abbasid leadership sent him east to take control of their movement in Khorasan. At first, not everyone trusted him. Some of the older Abbasid organizers had been working in the region long before his arrival. Why should they obey a young outsider whose background was unclear? But Abu Muslim gradually established his authority. He built alliances. He recruited supporters. And most importantly, he understood something the Umayyads had struggled to overcome. If the revolution became another fight between rival Arab tribes, it would fail. So the movement had to become something larger. Arabs from Khorasan joined it. Persians joined it. Muslim converts joined it. People with very different reasons for opposing the Umayyads began fighting beneath the same political banner. And in the year 747, the secret phase ended. Abu Muslim raised the black banners of revolt in Khorasan. The Abbasid revolution had begun. Black became the color of the movement. Black clothing, black standards, black banners carried above the soldiers moving against the Umayyads. What had once existed through whispers and hidden messages was now visible to everyone. There would be no turning back. The timing could hardly have been worse for the Umayyad government. The dynasty had recently passed through years of internal conflict. Caliphs had changed rapidly. Tribal factions fought one another, and in Khorasan itself, the Umayyad governor Nasr ibn Sayyar was already struggling with enemies before Abu Muslim openly entered the conflict. The empire was being forced to confront several crises at once. Abu Muslim took advantage. His forces gained territory. The Umayyad position in Khorasan began to collapse. And soon, the revolution was no longer confined to the distant east. Abbasid armies began marching west, across Iran, toward Iraq, toward the heart of the Caliphate. Damascus now understood the danger. The Umayyad Caliph was Marwan II. He was an experienced military commander, and he had no intention of surrendering the empire his family had ruled for generations. But every month the rebellion survived. The Abbasids became more dangerous. Cities changed hands. Umayyad armies were defeated, and the black banners moved closer to Iraq. Then came a major turning point. The Abbasid leader, Ibrahim, who had helped direct the underground movement, was captured by the Umayyads and died in captivity. The revolution could have collapsed with him. Instead, leadership passed to his brother, Abu al-Abbas. In the year 749, Abbasid forces entered Kufa in Iraq. There, Abu al-Abbas appeared before supporters and was recognized as Caliph. The Abbasids finally revealed the dynasty that intended to replace the Umayyads. Abu al-Abbas would become known as al-Safa, the first Abbasid Caliph. But there was one enormous problem. Declaring yourself Caliph did not make you ruler of the Muslim world. Marwan II was still alive. Damascus still belonged to the Umayyads, and the main Umayyad army had not yet been destroyed. Two caliphs now claimed authority. Two dynasties claimed the same empire, and there was no peaceful way to decide which one would survive. In January of the year 750, the two armies approached one another near the great Zab River, in what is now northern Iraq. On one side stood the dynasty that had ruled for almost 90 years. On the other, a revolutionary army that had traveled west beneath black banners from Khorasan. The battle that followed would not simply replace one ruler with another. It would end Umayyad rule in the heartlands of the Islamic world, move the center of political power east, and open the way for a completely different age. The age of the Abbasids. In January of the year 750, two armies faced one another near the great Zab River. On one side stood the forces of Marwan II, the last great military ruler of the Umayyad dynasty. For almost 90 years, his family had controlled the Caliphate from Damascus. They had conquered enormous territories, built powerful armies, and ruled an empire stretching from the Atlantic world to Central Asia. But now, that empire was fighting for its survival. Across the river stood the Abbasid army. Its soldiers had come from the east, many of them from Khorasan. Above them flew the black banners of the revolution. The Abbasid forces were commanded by Abdullah ibn Ali, an uncle of the new Abbasid Caliph, Abu al-Abbas. Marwan still possessed experience. He still possessed troops, and he had spent much of his life fighting wars. But the army facing him was different from the rebels the Umayyads had defeated before. The Abbasids were no longer a secret movement. They had captured cities. They controlled Iraq. They had proclaimed their own caliph. And behind their army stood years of organization, anger, and expectation. The battle began. The Umayyads attempted to break the Abbasid lines, but the Abbasid army held. Fighting continued near the river until the Umayyad formation began to collapse. Once soldiers started retreating, the river itself became a trap. Men crowded toward the water. Units lost contact with one another, and what had begun as an organized army became a desperate flight. Marwan survived, but his army did not. The Battle of the Zab was a catastrophic defeat for the Umayyads, and with their principal force broken, the road towards Syria was open. Marwan fled west, first through northern Mesopotamia, then towards Syria, but the Abbasids followed. City after city realized that the balance of power had changed. The Umayyad dynasty had ruled from Damascus for generations. Now, even Damascus could not save it. Abbasid forces entered the Syrian capital. The old center of the Caliphate had fallen. Marwan continued south through Palestine and eventually into Egypt. He was no longer fighting to preserve an empire. He was running for his life. Later that same year, Abbasid forces finally caught him in Egypt. Marwan II was killed, and with his death, Umayyad rule over the central Islamic world was effectively over. The revolution had succeeded, but revolutions rarely end when the old ruler disappears. For the Abbasids, winning the empire was only the beginning. Now they had to keep it. The first Abbasid Caliph was Abu al-Abbas. He had already been proclaimed in Kufa before the final defeat of Marwan. Later generations would remember him by the title Al-Safa. His victory represented more than a change of family. The political center of the Muslim world was beginning to move east. Damascus had been the great Umayyad capital. But the Abbasids depended heavily on support from Iraq and Khorasan. Their soldiers came from the east. Their revolution had been organized in the east, and many of the people responsible for putting them in power expected the new government to reward them. This created a dangerous question. Who had actually won the revolution? The Abbasid family? Or the men who had fought for them? No person represented that problem more clearly than Abu Muslim al-Khurasani. Without Abu Muslim, the Abbasid revolution might never have succeeded. He had transformed a secret political network into a military movement. He had taken control of Khorasan, he had recruited armies, and while Abbasid princes were now taking the highest positions in the new state, Abu Muslim remained enormously powerful in the east. To ordinary supporters in Khorasan, he was not simply another governor, he was the man who had led the revolution. His influence extended across soldiers, administrators, and local communities. And that made him useful, but it also made him dangerous. The Abbasids had just destroyed one dynasty. They knew better than anyone what could happen when a powerful movement grew far from the capital. There was another problem. The Umayyad family had not simply disappeared. Members of the dynasty still lived across the empire. Some could become rallying points for rebellion. Others could flee, raise armies, and return. The new Abbasid government moved aggressively against many potential Umayyad rivals. Members of the old ruling family were hunted down. Their political networks were broken. The Abbasids wanted to make certain that the dynasty they had defeated could never again challenge them in the heart of the Caliphate. But they did not catch everyone. One young Umayyad prince escaped. His name was Abd al-Rahman ibn Muawiyah. His family had lost everything. Abbasid forces controlled Syria. Relatives had been killed. The old dynasty appeared finished. So Abd al-Rahman fled west, across North Africa, moving farther and farther away from Abbasid power. Eventually, he reached Al-Andalus, the Iberian Peninsula. There, thousands of kilometers from Baghdad, the Umayyad story would begin again. In the year 756, Abd al-Rahman established an independent Umayyad emirate in Cordoba. The Abbasids had destroyed the Umayyad Caliphate in the east, but they had unintentionally helped create a rival Muslim state in the far west, one that would survive for generations. Back in Iraq, the Abbasids were building a new order, and they wanted that order to look different from what had come before. The Umayyads had ruled from Syria. The Abbasids increasingly looked toward Iraq. Persian administrators became more important. Khurasani soldiers formed a major part of the military establishment. Court culture began absorbing influences from older Persian imperial traditions. This did not mean the empire suddenly stopped being Arab or became Persian. The reality was far more complicated. What changed was the balance. The Abbasid state drew its strength from a much broader eastern political world than the Umayyad government had. And over time, that would reshape the culture of the Caliphate itself. The first years were not peaceful. Rebellions continued. Different groups who had helped overthrow the Umayyads now discovered that the Abbasids did not intend to share power equally with everyone. Some supporters had expected leadership to pass to another branch of the Prophet's family. Others had imagined a more radical political transformation. But the Abbasids had not fought a revolution merely to create an open competition for the throne. They intended to rule. Abu al-Abbas spent much of his short reign securing the dynasty. He appointed family members to important military and political positions. He rewarded supporters, and he worked to ensure that the Abbasid victory could not be reversed. But he would not rule for long. In the year 754, only a few years after the revolution, Abu al-Abbas died. He was still a young man. And suddenly, the new dynasty faced its first succession crisis. His brother, Abu Ja'far, claimed the Caliphate. He would become known to history as al-Mansur. But another member of the Abbasid family also had an army, Abdullah ibn Ali, the same commander who had defeated Marwan at the Battle of the Zab, believed he had his own claim to power. The dynasty that had just united to destroy the Umayyads was now preparing to fight itself. And once again, the man capable of deciding the outcome was Abu Muslim, the revolutionary leader from Khorasan. Abu Muslim defeated Abdullah's forces on behalf of al-Mansur. The new caliph survived, his rival was neutralized, and the Abbasid throne was secure. But al-Mansur now faced an uncomfortable reality. The man who had helped create the Abbasid dynasty had once again proved that he possessed enough military power to decide who ruled it. For al-Mansur, that could not continue. In 755, Abu Muslim was summoned to meet the Caliph. He entered believing he was coming before the ruler whose throne he had just defended. He would never leave. Al-Mansur accused him of disobedience and acting beyond his authority. Then, on the Caliph's command, guards killed Abu Muslim. The man who had raised the black banners in Khorasan, who had helped destroy the Umayyads, and who had placed the Abbasids on the throne, was dead. Al-Mansur had removed perhaps the most dangerous man in his empire. But killing Abu Muslim sent a clear message. The revolution was over. The Abbasids no longer needed revolutionaries. They needed a state. And al-Mansur intended to build one unlike anything the dynasty had possessed before. He needed a capital that belonged to the Abbasids, not Damascus, the city of their enemies, not Kufa, with its powerful factions and history of rebellion. He wanted a new city, a city built for his dynasty, a city positioned between the Mediterranean world, Persia, Central Asia, and the great trade routes of the East. In the year 762, construction began beside the Tigris River. Its official name would be Madinat al-Salam, the city of peace. But the world would remember it by another name, Baghdad. And within generations, the city al-Mansur built would become one of the richest, largest, and most important cities on earth. When al-Mansur chose the location for his new capital, there was no great imperial city waiting for him, so the Abbasids would build one. From the ground up, a city designed not merely to house a ruler, but to represent an entirely new dynasty. The location was carefully chosen. Baghdad stood beside the Tigris River, close to fertile agricultural lands, canals, and some of the most important trade routes connecting the eastern and western parts of the empire. To the west lay Syria and the Mediterranean world. To the east, Persia, Khorasan, Central Asia, and beyond them, the routes leading toward India and China. Goods could arrive by land, others could travel along rivers and canals. Food could be brought from the rich agricultural regions of Iraq. And unlike Damascus, Baghdad placed the Abbasid government much closer to the eastern territories that had helped bring the dynasty to power. For al-Mansur, the location was almost ideal, but the city itself would be even more remarkable. Construction began in the year 762. Al-Mansur gathered architects, engineers, craftsmen, laborers, and enormous quantities of building material. Brick kilns were established. Roads were prepared. Canals were improved. And slowly, on the western bank of the Tigris, the new Abbasid capital began to rise. Its official name was Madinat al-Salam, the city of peace, but history would remember it simply as Baghdad. At the heart of al-Mansur's original capital stood one of the most unusual city plans of the medieval world. The city was circular. Massive walls formed rings around the center. 4 great gates opened toward different regions of the empire, one toward Kufa, one toward Basra, one toward Syria, and one toward Khorasan. The roads from these gates led inward, toward the very center of the city, and there al-Mansur placed the symbols of Abbasid authority, the Caliph's palace, and the great mosque. The message was difficult to miss. The empire stretched in every direction, but at its center stood the Abbasid Caliph. This was not simply architecture, it was political theater built in brick. The old Umayyad capital had been inherited. Baghdad belonged to the Abbasids. They had selected the land. They had ordered the construction. They had placed themselves at its center. And as the city expanded, so did the world around it. The original round city was only the beginning. Markets developed beyond its walls. Neighborhoods spread along both sides of the Tigris. Bridges connected communities. Warehouses filled with goods. Boats moved constantly along the river. Baghdad began attracting people from across the Caliphate, Arab soldiers, Persian administrators, merchants from Central Asia, scholars from Iraq, artisans, poets, religious teachers, doctors, translators, servants, diplomats, and travelers from lands far beyond Abbasid control. The city was becoming more than a capital. It was becoming a meeting place between civilizations. But behind Baghdad's impressive walls stood a ruler who was very different from the legendary caliphs who would come after him. Al-Mansur was not remembered primarily for extravagant luxury. He was cautious, suspicious, disciplined, and deeply concerned with protecting the dynasty he had nearly lost. He had watched the Umayyads collapse. He had seen how quickly governors could rebel. He had seen commanders become kingmakers, and he had personally ordered the death of Abu Muslim, the man whose armies had helped create Abbasid rule. Al-Mansur understood a basic lesson of empire. Conquest created power, but administration kept it. So the Abbasid government became increasingly organized around a powerful bureaucracy. Taxes had to be collected. Letters had to reach distant governors. Armies had to be paid. Land had to be recorded. Appointments had to be controlled. And the enormous machinery of the empire required educated officials capable of keeping it functioning. Many of these administrators came from families shaped by older Persian traditions of government. Under the Abbasids, Persian political and court influences became increasingly visible. The Caliph remained the center of authority. Arabic remained the language of religion and a major language of administration and scholarship. But the Abbasid court was developing into something broader than the political culture that had existed under the early Umayyads. It was absorbing traditions from the civilizations the Muslims had conquered, and soon Baghdad would begin absorbing their knowledge as well. But before the great age of scholars and translators, Al-Mansur still had enemies to defeat. The Abbasids had come to power by presenting themselves as members of the Prophet Muhammad's wider family, but another branch of that family possessed an even closer connection: the descendants of Ali ibn Abi Talib and Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet. Many Muslims believed leadership should belong to this line, and some of them had supported the revolution against the Umayyads, expecting exactly that. When the Abbasids took the Caliphate for themselves, those hopes did not disappear. In the year 762, the same year construction of Baghdad began, a serious rebellion erupted. Muhammad ibn Abdullah, a descendant of Hassan ibn Ali, rose against Abbasid rule in Medina. He became known as al-Nafs al-Zakiyah, the pure soul. His brother Ibrahim later rebelled in Iraq. For al-Mansur, this was more than a local uprising. These men belonged to the Prophet's family. They could challenge the Abbasids using some of the very ideas that had helped the Abbasids overthrow the Umayyads. The rebellions were defeated. Muhammad was killed near Medina. Ibrahim's forces were destroyed in Iraq. Al-Mansur survived again, but a pattern was becoming clear. The Abbasids had promised change. Now, they were becoming an imperial dynasty themselves, and like every dynasty, they would defend their throne against anyone who challenged it. For nearly 2 decades, al-Mansur strengthened the foundations of the new state. He stabilized Abbasid rule. He developed Baghdad. He strengthened the administration. And by the time of his death in 775, the revolution that had begun in Khorasan was no longer a revolution. It was an empire. The throne passed to his son, al-Mahdi, and the character of the court began to change. Al-Mansur had been the builder. His successors inherited what he had built: a secure dynasty, a functioning government, and a capital positioned at the center of one of the richest regions in the world. Under al-Mahdi, the court became wealthier and more elaborate. Baghdad continued growing. Government patronage expanded. Poets and scholars increasingly found opportunities around the capital. The enormous revenues of the empire flowed toward Iraq. The Abbasids were beginning to experience something their revolutionary ancestors had never known: stability. And stability created wealth. Wealth created culture. And culture attracted talent from across the known world. Baghdad was perfectly positioned to benefit. Caravans arrived from the east, carrying silk, spices, paper, and valuable goods. Trade routes connected Iraq with India and Central Asia. Ships traveled through the Persian Gulf. Merchants connected Baghdad with ports and markets thousands of kilometers away. Money moved through the city. So did ideas. This combination would become one of the defining features of the Abbasid age: a vast empire, connected by trade, governed from a wealthy capital, and filled with people carrying knowledge from different intellectual traditions. The conditions were beginning to emerge for something extraordinary. But Baghdad had not reached its legendary height yet. After al-Mahdi came his son, al-Hadi. His reign was short. He died after little more than a year as Caliph. And in the year 786, the throne passed to his younger brother. His name was Harun al-Rashid. Centuries later, his name would become surrounded by legend. Stories would describe him walking through Baghdad at night in disguise, meeting ordinary people, discovering secrets, and ruling over unimaginable wealth. Some of those stories belonged more to literature than history, but the world behind them was real. Harun inherited an Abbasid state near the height of its wealth and prestige. Baghdad was expanding. Trade was flourishing. The Caliphate stretched across enormous territories, and one of the most powerful families in the empire, the Qarmatians, stood beside the throne. Yet beneath the splendor, new dangers were already forming. Powerful ministers were becoming almost too powerful. Regional governors were gaining independence. The question of succession remained dangerous, and the decisions Harun made about his own sons would eventually help tear the empire apart. But before the civil war, before the decline, and before Baghdad became vulnerable, the Abbasid world would experience the period for which it is remembered above all others. An age of extraordinary wealth, scholarship, translation, science, medicine, mathematics, and intellectual exchange. The age that later generations would call the Islamic Golden Age. And at the center of it stood Baghdad. When Harun al-Rashid became Caliph in the year 786, he inherited one of the richest and most powerful states in the world. He was still a young man, but he was not inexperienced. Before becoming Caliph, Harun had already taken part in major military campaigns against the Byzantine Empire. He had commanded armies, he had dealt with governors, and he had grown up inside the political world created by his father, Al-Mahdi. Now, that entire world belonged to him. From Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliphate stretched across North Africa, Egypt, Syria, Arabia, Iraq, Persia, and deep into Central Asia. Its cities were connected by roads, rivers, caravan routes, and trade networks reaching far beyond the borders of the empire. Gold traveled through its markets. Silk arrived from the east. Spices moved from India. African goods traveled north, and merchants from distant lands gathered in cities controlled by the Abbasids. At the center of this enormous system stood Baghdad. The city al-Mansur had founded only a generation earlier was rapidly becoming something much greater than its original walls. Neighborhoods spread outward. Palaces appeared along the Tigris. Markets became crowded with merchants and craftsmen, scholars, poets, physicians, theologians, lawyers, and administrators were drawn towards the capital. For later generations, the reign of Harun al-Rashid would come to represent the splendor of Abbasid Baghdad. And over time, history and legend began to mix. Harun became one of the most famous rulers in Islamic literature, in stories later connected with the collection known as 1001 Nights. The Caliph sometimes appears walking through Baghdad after dark, disguised among ordinary people, listening to their problems and discovering what truly happened inside his city. These stories should not simply be treated as historical records, but their existence tells us something important. Harun's court became so famous, and Abbasid Baghdad became so deeply associated with wealth and wonder, that later storytellers chose this period as the setting for some of their greatest tales. But Harun did not govern the empire alone. Behind the throne stood one of the most powerful political families of the Abbasid age, the Qarmatians. The Qarmatid family came from the eastern lands of the empire and had risen through Abbasid service. By the reign of Harun, they occupied some of the highest positions in government. Yahya ibn Khalid al-Barmaki had played an important role in Harun's early life. When Harun became Caliph, Yahya became his vizier. A vizier was far more than a simple advisor. He could supervise administration, coordinate officials, control access to the ruler, and help manage the enormous machinery of the state. Yahya's sons, Al-Fadl and Jafar, also became extremely influential. For years, the Barmakids stood near the center of Abbasid power. They administered provinces, they managed government business, they supported poets and scholars, and they accumulated enormous wealth and prestige. To many people, they represented the sophistication of the Abbasid court. But there was a danger hidden inside their success. They were becoming powerful enough to worry the Caliph himself. Harun was Caliph. There could only be one final source of authority, and in an empire created by revolution, a ruler could never completely forget what happened when another family became too powerful. For the moment, however, the Abbasid court projected confidence. Harun's government continued military pressure against the Byzantine Empire. The frontier between the two powers had remained a zone of warfare for generations. Raids crossed the border. Fortresses changed hands. Armies moved through the mountains of Anatolia. Neither empire could easily destroy the other, but each wanted to demonstrate strength. At times, the Byzantines agreed to pay tribute after Abbasid campaigns. At other times, war resumed. These conflicts helped create Harun's image as more than a ruler sitting inside a palace. He was also remembered as a caliph connected with the frontier, with military campaigns, and with the defense of Abbasid prestige. But Harun's world extended far beyond Byzantium. Thousands of kilometers to the west, another ruler was building his own empire, Charlemagne. The Frankish king controlled much of Western Europe, and diplomatic contact developed between his court and the Abbasids. Envoys traveled across enormous distances between the two worlds. Later accounts describe remarkable gifts passing between the courts. Among the most famous was an elephant, known in European sources as Abul Abbas. For people in Charlemagne's lands, the arrival of such an animal must have been extraordinary. But the elephant was more than a curiosity. It symbolized a much larger reality. Baghdad was connected to a world whose trade routes reached animals, luxury goods, knowledge, and technologies that were rare or unknown in much of Western Europe. The Abbasid capital sat near the crossroads of civilizations, and that position was beginning to transform its intellectual life. Books traveled with merchants, texts moved between languages, ideas crossed religious boundaries. Christian scholars, Muslim scholars, Jewish scholars, Persian intellectual traditions, Greek philosophical works, Indian mathematics, and knowledge inherited from earlier civilizations could all meet within the wider Abbasid world. The great translation movement that would become especially famous under later caliphs did not suddenly appear from nothing. Its foundations were already developing. Earlier, Abbasid rulers had shown interest in scientific and intellectual works. Translations from Persian, Greek, Syriac, and Indian traditions were already circulating. During Harun's reign, Baghdad's growing wealth and court culture helped create an environment in which scholars and translators could receive powerful patrons. Medicine was especially important. The Abbasid court required physicians, and some of the most respected medical families came from Christian communities with access to Greek medical traditions preserved through Syriac scholarship. This is one of the most important things to understand about the Abbasid Golden Age. It was not the achievement of one ethnicity or one city or even one religious community working alone. It was created inside a civilization large enough to connect different traditions and wealthy enough to support people who studied them. Arabic increasingly became the great shared language of scholarship. A Persian physician, a Christian translator, an Arab mathematician, or a scholar from Central Asia could participate in the same intellectual world. Knowledge that had once existed in separate languages could now be collected, translated, criticized, and expanded. But the greatest explosion of this movement was still ahead. First, Harun had to deal with the politics of his own court. And then, without fully realizing it, he would make a decision that would eventually bring war directly into Baghdad. In the year 803, the relationship between Harun and the Barmakids suddenly collapsed. Jafar al-Barmaki, one of Harun's closest companions, was executed. Other members of the family were arrested. Their wealth was confiscated. Their political influence disappeared almost overnight. For generations, historians and storytellers have tried to explain exactly why. Later stories offered dramatic explanations involving secret relationships, personal betrayal, and anger inside the royal family. But the political explanation may have been far simpler. The Barmakids had become extraordinarily powerful. They had their own supporters, their own networks, their own wealth, and influence across the government. For a caliph determined to remain master of his empire, that could become intolerable. Their fall shocked the court, but Harun remained in control. The greater threat to the dynasty would come from somewhere much closer, his own family. Harun had several sons, and like many rulers before him, he faced a question capable of destroying an empire. Who would rule after him? His solution appeared careful. He divided responsibility between his sons. His son Muhammad, known as Al-Amin, would become Caliph first. Another son, Abdullah, known as Al-Ma'mun, would hold enormous authority in the east, especially in Khorasan, and was designated to succeed Al-Amin. A third son, Al-Qasim, was also included within the succession arrangement. On paper, the plan was designed to prevent conflict. In reality, Harun was giving different princes, different territories, different political supporters, and different armies. He was dividing power among men who might one day compete for the same throne. In the year 809, Harun traveled east. Trouble had emerged in Khorasan, the same region where the Abbasid revolution had begun decades earlier. During the journey, Harun became ill. He reached the city of Tus in northeastern Iran, and there, the caliph, whose reign became synonymous with the splendor of Baghdad, died. Al-Amin became caliph. For the moment, Harun's succession plan appeared to have worked. But Baghdad supported Al-Amin. Khorasan supported Al-Ma'mun. Powerful officials surrounded both brothers, and each side had reasons to distrust the other. Soon, Al-Amin attempted to alter the succession. He wanted his own son to inherit the throne instead of Al-Ma'mun. Al-Ma'mun refused to surrender his position. Words became threats. Threats became mobilization, and mobilization became war. The Abbasid dynasty had survived Umayyad armies, rebellions, and powerful ministers. Now, two sons of Harun al-Rashid were going to fight each other for control of it. The conflict would devastate Iraq. It would bring armies into the streets of Baghdad. And the victorious brother would become one of the most important patrons of scholarship in Islamic history. His name was Al-Ma'mun. But before his scholars could transform Baghdad, his soldiers would have to conquer it. Harun had several sons, and like many rulers before him, he faced a question capable of destroying an empire. Who would rule after him? His solution appeared careful. He divided responsibility between his sons. His son Muhammad, known as Al-Amin, would become Caliph first. Another son, Abdullah, known as Al-Ma'mun, would hold enormous authority in the east, especially in Khorasan, and was designated to succeed Al-Amin. A third son, Al-Qasim, was also included within the succession arrangement. On paper, the plan was designed to prevent conflict. In reality, Harun was giving different princes, different territories, different political supporters, and different armies. He was dividing power among men who might one day compete for the same throne. In the year 809, Harun traveled east. Trouble had emerged in Khorasan, the same region where the Abbasid revolution had begun decades earlier. During the journey, Harun became ill. He reached the city of Tus in northeastern Iran, and there, the Caliph, whose reign became synonymous with the splendor of Baghdad, died. Al-Amin became Caliph. For the moment, Harun's succession plan appeared to have worked. But Baghdad supported Al-Amin. Khorasan supported Al-Ma'mun. Powerful officials surrounded both brothers, and each side had reasons to distrust the other. Soon, Al-Amin attempted to alter the succession. He wanted his own son to inherit the throne instead of Al-Ma'mun. Al-Ma'mun refused to surrender his position. Words became threats. Threats became mobilization, and mobilization became war. The Abbasid dynasty had survived Umayyad armies, rebellions, and powerful ministers. Now, two sons of Harun al-Rashid were going to fight each other for control of it. The conflict would devastate Iraq. It would bring armies into the streets of Baghdad, and the victorious brother would become one of the most important patrons of scholarship in Islamic history. His name was Al-Ma'mun. But before his scholars could transform Baghdad, his soldiers would have to conquer it. Harun al-Rashid had tried to prevent a war between his sons. Instead, his succession plan helped create one. After Harun died in the year 809, his son Al-Amin became Caliph in Baghdad. His brother, Al-Ma'mun, remained far to the east, in Khorasan. At first, the arrangement created by their father still existed. Al-Amin ruled the Caliphate. Al-Ma'mun controlled Khorasan and remained next in line for the throne. But neither brother completely trusted the other. Baghdad and Khorasan had become two different centers of power. Al-Amin was surrounded by the political and military elite of the capital. Al-Ma'mun had his own supporters in the east, including powerful Persian administrators and Khorasani soldiers. And gradually, the agreement Harun had created began to collapse. Al-Amin wanted the caliphate to pass to his own son, not to his brother. He removed Al-Ma'mun from the succession and named his young son as heir. To Al-Ma'mun, this was not simply an insult, it was a direct threat. The documents that were supposed to protect the succession had failed. Now, the question would be decided by armies. In the year 811, Al-Amin sent a large force east toward Khorasan. Its commander was Ali ibn Isa ibn Mahan. His mission was clear: defeat Al-Ma'mun and bring the eastern provinces back under Baghdad's control. Al-Ma'mun faced a serious problem. The army moving toward him was larger than the force immediately available to defend Khorasan. For a moment, even his position seemed uncertain. But one commander stepped forward. His name was Tahir ibn Hussein. Tahir would become one of the most important generals of the civil war. His army was smaller, but near the city of Ray, he met the advancing forces from Baghdad, and against expectations, Tahir won. Ali ibn Isa was killed, his army collapsed, and suddenly the road west was open. What had begun as Al-Amin's attempt to remove his brother was becoming an invasion of his own territory. Tahir continued advancing. Cities in western Iran fell. Other commanders joined the campaign. Al-Ma'mun's authority expanded, while Al-Amin's began to disappear. The closer the eastern armies came to Baghdad, the more supporters abandoned the Caliph. And by the year 812, the war reached the capital itself. Baghdad, the city built by al-Mansur, the city enriched under Harun al-Rashid, the city that had become the symbol of Abbasid power, was now surrounded by Abbasid armies. This was not a foreign invasion. Muslims were fighting Muslims. Abbasids were fighting Abbasids. And the sons of one of the dynasty's greatest caliphs were tearing apart the capital their family had built. The siege became brutal. Baghdad was far larger than the original round city. Much of its population lived in neighborhoods and suburbs beyond the old central walls. That meant the fighting did not remain outside the city. It entered the streets. Barricades appeared. Siege engines hurled projectiles. Fighters occupied buildings. Boats moved along the Tigris. Neighborhoods became battlefields. At times, the fighting became house to house. Al-Amin's professional forces were weakening. So desperate defenders from among Baghdad's population were armed and sent into the fighting. For months, the city resisted. But the cost was enormous. Homes were damaged. Markets were disrupted. Food became harder to obtain. Commerce suffered. And areas of one of the richest cities in the world were reduced to ruins. This was Baghdad, fighting itself. Outside, Tahir tightened his grip. Other forces loyal to Al-Ma'mun approached from different directions. Inside, Al-Amin's authority continued to collapse. Officials deserted him, soldiers changed sides, and the caliph who had once commanded the entire Abbasid state was gradually trapped inside his own capital. By September of the year 813, the end was close. Al-Amin attempted to negotiate. He hoped to place himself under the protection of another commander, Hathama ibn Ayyan. But events moved too quickly. Al-Amin attempted to escape across the Tigris. He was captured by Tahir's men. Soon afterward, the Caliph was killed. He was around 27 years old. The son of Harun al-Rashid, the ruler of Baghdad, had died fighting his own brother for the throne. The civil war between the brothers was over. Al-Ma'mun was now the undisputed Abbasid Caliph. But there was something strange about the victory. The new Caliph was not in Baghdad. He remained hundreds of kilometers away, in the eastern city of Merv. The Abbasid capital had been devastated in his name, while the man who had won the throne governed from Khorasan. And beside Al-Ma'mun stood another extraordinarily powerful man, Al-Fadl ibn Sahl. Al-Fadl had become one of Al-Ma'mun's most important advisors. He controlled enormous influence over both civilian government and military affairs. To supporters in Baghdad, this was deeply troubling. The Caliphate had been created by the Abbasid family. Baghdad had been built as its capital. Yet now, the ruler remained in distant Khorasan, surrounded by eastern officials. Suspicion grew, and Al-Ma'mun soon made a decision that shocked the Abbasid family even more. In the year 817, he named Ali al-Rida, a descendant of Ali ibn Abi Talib, as his heir. Al-Rida was one of the most respected figures descended from the Prophet Muhammad. Today, 12 Shia Muslims remember him as their 8th Imam. For Al-Ma'mun, the appointment may have been an attempt to reconcile rival branches of the Prophet's family and reduce generations of political conflict. But in Baghdad, many Abbasids saw something else. They feared their own dynasty might lose the throne. The traditional Abbasid black was even replaced at court by green, a symbolic change that only increased the anger. Baghdad rebelled. Members of the Abbasid family refused to accept Al-Ma'mun's decision, and they proclaimed another man as Caliph, Ibrahim ibn al-Mahdi. The war between the brothers had ended, but the crisis inside the Abbasid state had not. Al-Ma'mun could no longer rule the empire indefinitely from Merv. He began moving west, toward Iraq, toward the city that had suffered through years of political chaos. But during the journey, the political world around him changed rapidly. His powerful minister, Al-Fadl ibn Sal, was assassinated. Not long afterward, Ali al-Rida died in Khorasan. The controversial succession arrangement disappeared with him, and Al-Ma'mun continued west. Finally, in the year 819, almost 10 years after the death of his father, Al-Ma'mun entered Baghdad. The black color of the Abbasids returned. The rival caliph disappeared from power, and for the first time since Harun al-Rashid's death, Baghdad once again had an Abbasid ruler firmly established inside the capital. But Al-Ma'mun inherited a different city from the one his father had known. Baghdad had survived, but it had been scarred by civil war, and the conflict had revealed a weakness that would haunt the Abbasids for centuries. The Caliph might rule an enormous empire, but he depended on generals, governors, administrators, and armies whose loyalty could never be guaranteed. Yet from the destruction of the civil war, something remarkable was about to emerge. Al-Ma'mun was deeply interested in scholarship. During his reign, Baghdad became associated with an extraordinary expansion of literature, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and the translation of knowledge from older civilizations. The city that had just watched brothers fight for its streets would soon become famous for people fighting over something very different: ideas. Greek philosophy would be translated into Arabic. Indian mathematics would meet Persian and Arabic scholarship. Astronomers would study the heavens. Physicians would challenge old medical ideas, and scholars working in Arabic would produce discoveries that traveled far beyond the Abbasid world. Baghdad had survived the war. Now, its greatest intellectual age was about to begin. Baghdad had survived civil war. Its streets had been torn apart. Its rulers had fought each other, and thousands had watched the capital of the Abbasids become a battlefield. But under Al-Ma'mun, the city entered one of the most remarkable intellectual periods in medieval history. The Abbasids had inherited more than territory. They had inherited civilizations. To the west lay the intellectual traditions of Greece and Rome. To the east, Persia, India, and the ancient cultures of Central Asia, across Syria and Mesopotamia. Christian scholars had preserved important works of Greek medicine, philosophy, and science, often through the Syriac language. The Abbasid world connected all of them, and Baghdad had the wealth, the scholars, and the political power to bring their knowledge together. This was the world of Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. Today, the House of Wisdom is sometimes imagined as a gigantic university, filled with thousands of scholars discovering modern science inside a single building. The reality was more complicated. Bayt al-Hikmah appears to have been connected to the Abbasid court as a library, a collection of books, and a center of scholarly activity. But Baghdad's translation movement was much larger than one institution. Knowledge was being translated and studied in palaces, private homes, libraries, hospitals, mosques, and scholarly circles across the city. The Golden Age was not created by one building, it was created by an entire intellectual culture. And one of the most important forces behind that culture was translation. Texts that had been written centuries earlier began appearing in Arabic. Works associated with Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Galen, Ptolemy, and other thinkers of the ancient world were translated, studied, and debated. Some came directly from Greek, others passed through Syriac. Persian works were translated. Indian astronomical and mathematical knowledge entered the same intellectual world. And Arabic became the language in which these traditions could meet. This mattered enormously, because translation was not simply copying words from one language into another. A translator had to understand the idea. A physician translating medicine needed to understand medicine. A mathematician translating geometry needed to understand mathematics. And once scholars understood these books, they began questioning them, correcting them, combining them, and building new ideas from them. One of the greatest translators of the age was a Christian scholar named Hunayn ibn Ishaq. Hunayn became famous for translating medical and philosophical works, especially those associated with the Greek physician Galen. But he did not simply translate every manuscript placed before him. He compared copies. He looked for errors. He searched for better versions of texts, and he developed methods intended to preserve the meaning of difficult scientific language. His work, and the work of translators around him, helped make generations of ancient medical knowledge accessible in Arabic. And the people doing this work were not all the same. Some were Muslims, some were Christians, some came from Persian families, others came from Arab backgrounds, some worked in medicine, others in astronomy, philosophy, or mathematics. The Abbasid intellectual world did not depend on everyone having the same origin. It depended on people being able to communicate through a shared scholarly language, Arabic. And perhaps no field shows the consequences of this exchange better than mathematics. During the reign of Al-Ma'mun, a scholar from the eastern regions of the Caliphate worked in Baghdad. His name was Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. Al-Khwarizmi studied mathematics, astronomy, and geography. One of his works explained methods for solving mathematical problems through what he called al-Jabr. From that word, centuries later, European languages would receive the word algebra. But al-Khwarizmi did not invent mathematics from nothing. His work developed within a world where Indian numerical traditions Greek geometry, and earlier mathematical ideas could be studied together. That is what made Abbasid scholarship so powerful. Knowledge could arrive from somewhere else, without remaining frozen in its original form. It could be absorbed, reorganized, and improved. Even the word algorithm would eventually be derived from the Latin form of al-Khwarizmi's name. And mathematics was only one field. Astronomy became a major concern of the Abbasid court. Al-Ma'mun supported observations of the sky. Astronomers examined earlier models inherited from Ptolemy and others. Tables were created to calculate the movements of celestial bodies. The stars mattered for practical reasons: calendars, navigation, timekeeping, determining prayer times, and establishing geographical coordinates. But there was also something more fundamental. Scholars wanted to know how the universe worked. According to medieval accounts, Al-Ma'mun even sponsored attempts to measure the size of the earth. Teams of scholars measured distance across level ground, while observing changes in the position of the stars. Their goal was ambitious: estimate the length of 1 degree of the Earth's circumference, and from that, calculate the size of the planet itself. More than 1,000 years ago, scholars working under an Abbasid Caliph were trying to measure the Earth using mathematics and observation. Baghdad also became a center for philosophy. One of the most important early philosophers writing in Arabic was Al-Kindi. He came from an Arab family, but worked inside an intellectual environment filled with translated Greek ideas. Al-Kindi wrote on philosophy, mathematics, medicine, music, optics, and many other subjects. He believed that knowledge should be accepted wherever it came from. Greek ideas did not have to remain Greek. Indian mathematics did not have to remain Indian. Persian learning did not have to remain Persian. Knowledge could become part of a larger intellectual tradition. This attitude would shape generations of scholars after him. Then there were the Banu Musa, the 3 sons of Musa ibn Shakir, Muhammad, Ahmad, and Al-Hasan. They studied mathematics and astronomy, but they also became famous for mechanical devices. Their work described ingenious machines, valves, automatic mechanisms, fountains, and devices that manipulated water and air. The intellectual world of Baghdad was therefore not limited to abstract philosophy. Scholars were calculating, observing, building, measuring, and experimenting with mechanisms. And books were becoming easier to produce. Paper-making techniques had spread westward from China through Central Asia. By the Abbasid period, paper became increasingly important across the Islamic world. It was cheaper and more practical for many uses than parchment. And as paper became widely available, Baghdad developed an extraordinary culture of books. Copyists reproduced manuscripts, booksellers operated in markets, libraries grew, scholars could collect texts, write commentaries, and send written knowledge across enormous distances. Imagine what that meant. A mathematical idea originating in India could travel west. A Greek medical text preserved by a Syriac-speaking Christian could be translated into Arabic. A scholar in Baghdad could study it, challenge part of it, and write something new. That new work could then travel to Damascus, Cairo, Central Asia, North Africa, or Al-Andalus. Centuries later, some of those Arabic works would themselves be translated into Latin and studied in Europe. Knowledge was moving in circles across civilizations. And Baghdad stood near the center of that movement. But the Golden Age was not only science and philosophy. This was also an extraordinary period for Islamic scholarship itself. The great traditions of Hadith collection, Islamic law, Arabic grammar, Quranic interpretation, and theology were developing across the Abbasid world. Scholars traveled enormous distances seeking knowledge. A student might leave his home, travel hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. Hear a hadith from a particular teacher, copy a text, and continue to another city. Baghdad became one important destination within this vast network. But intellectual energy also created disagreement. And Al-Ma'mun was not a neutral observer. The Caliph had strong theological interests of his own. He became associated with rationalist theological ideas, especially those connected with the Mu'tazila. One controversy became particularly important. Was the Quran eternal and uncreated, or had it been created by God? For modern listeners, the question may sound abstract. In the Abbasid world, it became political. Near the end of his reign, Al-Ma'mun ordered officials and religious scholars to be questioned about the issue. This policy became known as the Mihna, a kind of theological inquisition. Scholars who refused the official position could face punishment. Among the most famous men who resisted was Ahmad ibn Hanbal. He rejected the demand to declare the Quran created. He was imprisoned, and under the next caliph, he was beaten. The episode exposed a question far bigger than one theological argument. How much authority should the caliph have over religion? Could the ruler decide theological truth and force scholars to accept it? The answer would shape the relationship between political rulers and religious scholars for generations. Al-Ma'mun never lived to see the full consequences. In the year 833, while campaigning near the Byzantine frontier, he died. His reign had transformed Abbasid intellectual life, but the next caliph would transform something else: the army. Al-Ma'mun's brother, Al-Mu'tasim, took the throne, and Al-Mu'tasim increasingly relied on military slaves and soldiers recruited from Turkic regions of Central Asia. They were skilled fighters. They were personally connected to the caliph, and at first, they seemed like the perfect solution to an old Abbasid problem. A ruler needed soldiers who depended on him, rather than soldiers tied to Baghdad's old political factions. But the new troops created tensions inside the capital. Violence broke out between soldiers and civilians. Resentment grew, and eventually Al-Mu'tasim made an extraordinary decision. The Abbasid Caliph would leave Baghdad. In the year 836, he founded a new capital farther north on the Tigris. Its name was Samarra. Baghdad had become the intellectual center of an empire, but political power was moving away from it. And the soldiers created to protect the caliph would soon become powerful enough to control him. When Al-Mu'tasim became caliph in the year 833, he inherited a problem that had troubled the Abbasids from the beginning. How could a caliph command an enormous empire without becoming dependent on the same powerful groups that might one day challenge him? The Khurasani armies had helped create the Abbasid dynasty, but generations had passed since the revolution. Old military families had developed their own interests. Baghdad was filled with political factions, and the caliph wanted soldiers whose loyalty belonged directly to him. So Al-Mu'tasim increasingly turned toward a new military force, soldiers from the Turkic and Central Asian world. Many were brought into Abbasid service as military slaves, trained as professional warriors, and tied personally to the ruler and his commanders. They were outsiders to Baghdad's old political rivalries, and that was exactly the point. Al-Mu'tasim believed he was creating an army that would depend upon the Caliph. For a time, it worked. These soldiers became an elite part of the Abbasid military system. They were disciplined, they were effective cavalrymen, and they helped give Al-Mu'tasim a powerful force that could be used against rebellions and against enemies beyond the borders of the Caliphate. But Baghdad did not welcome them. Thousands of soldiers were now living among a civilian population that did not trust them. Arguments became fights. Fights became violence. And resentment between Baghdad's inhabitants and the Caliph's new military grew increasingly dangerous. Al-Mu'tasim needed a solution. His answer was extraordinary. He would move the government away from Baghdad. In the year 836, roughly a century after the Abbasids had begun building their great capital, the Caliph established a new seat of government farther north along the Tigris. Samarra. The new capital became far more than a military camp. Palaces stretched along the river. Military districts were built for different groups of soldiers. Government offices followed the Caliph north. Mosques, gardens, race courses, and enormous royal complexes appeared across the landscape. For more than half a century, Samarra would serve as the political capital of the Abbasid world. Baghdad remained wealthy. Its scholars did not disappear. Its markets remained important. Its intellectual life continued. But the ruler was gone. The court was gone. And the men carrying weapons around the Caliph now lived beside him in a city created largely for them. At first, this seemed to strengthen the throne. Al-Mu'tasim's military could be extremely effective. In the year 838, the Abbasids launched a major campaign against the Byzantine Empire. Their forces penetrated deep into Byzantine territory and captured the important city of Amorium. The campaign demonstrated that the Abbasid military machine was still capable of projecting enormous force. But military strength carried a hidden price. The more the Caliph depended on these soldiers, the more important their commanders became. And powerful soldiers eventually learned something dangerous. A ruler who depends on you can also be pressured by you. Al-Mu'tasim died in 842. His son, Al-Wathiq, became Caliph. The new military order remained in place. So did Samarra, and so did the growing influence of commanders around the throne. When Al-Wathiq died 5 years later, another Abbasid prince became Caliph, Al-Mutawakkil. His reign would become one of the great turning points in Abbasid history. Al-Mutawakkil attempted to strengthen the authority of the Caliph. He also ended the mihna, the policy through which earlier caliphs had tried to force scholars to accept an official theological position. The relationship between ruler and religious scholarship began changing, and the theological policies associated with Al-Ma'mun's court lost official support. At the same time, Al-Mutawakkil transformed Samarra itself. He ordered enormous building projects. Palaces rose across the region, and one structure became especially famous: the Great Mosque of Samarra. Built during his reign, it was among the largest mosques of its age. Beside it stood a huge spiral minaret, rising above the flat landscape of Iraq. Even today, its remains are one of the most recognizable monuments of Abbasid architecture. From the outside, the Abbasid Caliphate still appeared magnificent. A great capital, massive palaces, powerful armies, a ruler surrounded by ceremony. But inside the court, the balance of power was becoming unstable. Al-Mutawakkil understood that some military commanders had become too powerful. He tried to weaken their influence. He attempted to move appointments. He redistributed power, and tensions grew between the Caliph, his commanders, and members of his own family. Once again, the question of succession made everything worse. Al-Mutawakkil had sons who expected to inherit power. Among them was Al-Muntasir. Relations between father and son deteriorated. At the same time, powerful Turkish officers feared that Al-Mutawakkil intended to remove them from their positions. The throne, the army, and the royal family were now moving toward confrontation. Then, in December of the year 861, everything changed. Al-Mutawakkil was inside his palace at Samarra. That night, Turkish officers entered. The Caliph was assassinated. For more than a century, Abbasid Caliphs had ordered the deaths of rebels, generals, governors, and rivals. Now, soldiers inside the Caliph's own capital had killed the ruler himself. The consequences were enormous. Before this moment, the military served the Caliph. After it, everyone knew that the military could kill one. Al-Muntasir, the murdered Caliph's son, became the next ruler. But he reigned for only a few months. He died in 862. And now the soldiers surrounding the throne faced a remarkable question. Who should become Caliph? The answer increasingly depended not simply on Abbasid blood, but on which candidate powerful military commanders were willing to support. They chose al-Musta'in. But rivalries inside Samarra continued. Different military factions competed for money, appointments, and influence. The government needed enormous sums to pay its troops, but political instability damaged the state's ability to collect revenue. And the weaker the finances became, the more dangerous the soldiers became. An unpaid army does not remain loyal for long. In 865, al-Musta'in fled Samarra. He went to Baghdad. The military leaders in Samarra responded by supporting another Abbasid prince, al-Mu'taz. Once again, two members of the same dynasty stood on opposite sides. And once again, Baghdad became involved in an Abbasid civil war. For months, forces loyal to Samarra fought against those supporting al-Musta'in in Baghdad. Eventually, Baghdad could no longer continue the struggle. Al-Musta'in abdicated. Al-Mu'taz became the uncontested caliph. But surrender did not save al-Musta'in. He was later killed. The message was becoming impossible to ignore. The title of caliph remained sacred and prestigious, but the man holding it could now be removed, imprisoned, or killed by the military forces surrounding him. Al-Mu'taz tried to regain control. He attempted to play powerful commanders against one another. Some were removed, some were killed. But the deeper problem remained. There was not enough money. The empire was becoming harder to control. Provincial revenues did not always reach the capital. Governors were becoming increasingly independent. Soldiers demanded their pay. And the caliph possessed the title of supreme ruler, without always possessing the resources needed to make that title real. In 869, Al-Mu'taz himself was forced from power. He died shortly afterward. Another caliph followed, Al-Mu'tadi. He attempted to restore discipline. He presented himself as a more austere ruler and tried to reduce the influence of the military elite. But by now, the problem was larger than one man's personality. The soldiers knew their strength, and when al-Mu'tadi confronted them, he was killed in 870. 9 years had passed since the assassination of al-Mutawakkil. During that period, 4 caliphs had died, 3 of them violently. Historians would later describe these years as the anarchy at Samarra. The Abbasid dynasty had not collapsed, but something fundamental had changed. The early caliphs had commanded generals. Now, generals could make and unmake caliphs. And every struggle inside Samarra created opportunities outside it. Across the empire, local rulers watched the chaos. If Baghdad and Samarra could barely control their own armies, why should a distant governor surrender all of his power to them? Egypt moved toward greater independence. Dynasties in Iran controlled territories increasingly in their own names. North Africa was already fragmented, and in the east, new military powers were emerging. The Abbasid Caliphate still appeared on maps as an enormous empire. Reality was becoming different. The caliph's name might still be spoken in distant mosques. Coins might still acknowledge his authority. Rulers might still seek recognition from Baghdad. But recognition was not the same as control. In 870, al-Mu'tamid became caliph. His succession effectively ended the worst period of chaos in Samarra. But al-Mu'tamid would not become the true military savior of the dynasty. That role fell largely to his brother, al-Muwaffaq. Al-Muwaffaq rebuilt relationships with the army. He restored a degree of military stability, and he became the real power behind much of the government. He would need every soldier he could gather, because while the Abbasids had been fighting among themselves, an enormous rebellion had erupted in southern Iraq. Thousands of rebels had gathered around a charismatic leader. They captured towns, they defeated armies, they threatened Basra, and for years they would force the Abbasid government into one of the most difficult wars in its history. They became known as the Zanj, and they were not the only threat. In the east, a former coppersmith named Yaqub ibn al-Layth was building an army of his own. His Safarid forces would conquer huge areas of Iran, destroy an old Abbasid client dynasty, and eventually march toward Iraq itself. The Abbasids had survived the soldiers of Samarra, but they had paid a terrible price. The government had weakened. The provinces had learned they could survive without direct control from the caliph. And military commanders had discovered that political power could belong to the man holding the sword, rather than the man carrying the title. By the end of the 9th century, the Abbasid court would eventually return from Samarra to Baghdad. The temporary capital that had once represented military strength would rapidly lose its political importance. But the Abbasids could not return to the world of Harun al-Rashid. That world was gone. The Caliphate was still alive. Baghdad was still magnificent. Islamic scholarship and culture continued to flourish. But politically, the empire was breaking into pieces. And soon, the rulers of those pieces would become powerful enough to enter Baghdad itself. The Abbasids had once ruled provinces stretching across continents. Now, Egypt, Iran, North Africa, and Central Asia were producing rulers of their own. Some still respected the Abbasid Caliph. Some still placed his name on their coins. Some still mentioned him during the Friday prayer. But increasingly, the Caliph ruled in name, while other men ruled in reality. And the process did not happen all at once. There was no single day when the Abbasid Empire suddenly disappeared. Instead, pieces slowly broke away, one province at a time, one governor at a time, one army at a time. Sometimes the new rulers openly rejected Baghdad, but often they did something far more convenient. They kept the Abbasid Caliph as a symbol while governing independently. The Caliph still possessed enormous religious prestige, so there was often little reason to abolish him. A ruler could govern his own territory, collect his own taxes, command his own army, and still claim that he acted under Abbasid authority. The empire was becoming a world of separate states, connected by the idea of the Caliphate, but no longer controlled from one palace. One of the clearest examples appeared in Egypt. In the year 868, a Turkish military commander named Ahmad ibn Tulun arrived there. Officially, he served the Abbasid government. But Egypt was wealthy. Its agriculture produced enormous revenue. Its location connected the Mediterranean with the Red Sea, and Baghdad was too distracted by its own crises to watch every decision made by a distant governor. Ibn Tulun began building his own power. He created an army loyal to him. He kept more of Egypt's revenues inside Egypt. He expanded into Syria. And eventually, he governed a territory that functioned almost like an independent state. He even built a new administrative center near Fustat, and there, a great mosque that still carries his name. The Tulunids did not immediately declare that the Abbasid Caliphate no longer existed. They did not need to. They could acknowledge the Caliph while ignoring much of his government. The same pattern appeared farther east. In Iran, Yaqub ibn al-Layth had risen from extremely humble beginnings. Later tradition remembered him as a coppersmith. He became a soldier, then a commander, then the founder of the Safarid dynasty. His armies swept across eastern Iran and Afghanistan. Old governors were defeated. Territories that had once depended upon Baghdad fell under his control. Eventually, Yaqub looked west, toward Iraq. In the year 876, his army advanced dangerously close to Baghdad. For the Abbasids, this was a frightening moment. A ruler who had built his power far from the capital was now approaching the heart of the Caliphate itself. But near Deir al-Aqul, the Abbasid forces stopped him. Yaqub was defeated. Baghdad survived. Yet the lesson was impossible to ignore. A provincial warlord had come close enough that the Caliphate had been forced to defend Iraq itself. And while armies challenged Abbasid authority from outside, rebellion was tearing apart southern Iraq from within. The Zanj rebellion had begun in the year 869. Its leader, Ali ibn Muhammad, attracted large numbers of followers in the marshlands and agricultural regions around Basra. Many of those who joined him came from extremely poor and exploited communities. Among them were laborers working in brutal conditions in the salt marshes of southern Iraq. But the rebellion quickly became more than a revolt of workers. It became an organized military movement. The rebels built strongholds. They defeated government armies. They captured territory. And in the year 871, they attacked Basra. one of the greatest commercial cities of the Abbasid world was devastated. For years, the Abbasid government struggled to destroy the rebellion, and once again, the man who carried much of the burden was not the Caliph himself, but his brother, Al-Muwaffaq. Al-Muwaffaq had already become the real military power behind the throne. Now, he concentrated Abbasid forces against the Zanj. The campaign was difficult. The rebels knew the marshes. They possessed fortified positions. And earlier, Abbasid attacks had repeatedly failed. But slowly, government forces pushed them back. Supply routes were cut. Strongholds were surrounded. And in the year 883, after roughly 14 years of rebellion, the final Zanj center was captured. The rebellion was over, but the Abbasid state had spent enormous amounts of money, men, and political energy simply trying to regain control of territory close to its own capital. The empire was surviving, but survival was becoming expensive. Then, for a brief period, the Abbasids began to recover. In the year 892, Al-Mu'tadid became Caliph. Under him, Baghdad once again became the permanent center of Abbasid government. The age of Samarra was effectively over. Al-Mu'tadid was energetic, militarily experienced, and determined to restore direct Abbasid authority wherever possible. The government improved its finances. Some territories in Iraq and surrounding regions were brought back under stronger control. The court became more stable. For a moment, it seemed possible that the Abbasids might reverse the decline. But the world around them had changed too much. New dynasties were no longer temporary accidents. They were becoming permanent features of the Muslim world. Far to the east, the Samanids ruled Transoxiana and Khorasan. They officially recognized Abbasid authority, but governed their own powerful state. Their cities, especially Bukhara and Samarkand, became major centers of Persian culture, trade, and scholarship. Persian language and literature experienced a remarkable revival under their rule. And this revealed something important about the new Islamic world. Baghdad was no longer the only center of civilization. Knowledge was spreading, power was spreading, culture was spreading. Cities far from Iraq could now compete with the Abbasid capital in wealth, learning, and influence. The Abbasids had helped create an enormous connected civilization. Now, that civilization was becoming too large to belong to the Abbasids alone. And then came enemies who challenged something even more important than Abbasid political control. They challenged the Caliphs' religious legitimacy. In the late 9th century, a radical movement known as the Qarmatians emerged. They established power in eastern Arabia and became one of the most dangerous enemies of the Abbasid state. Their forces attacked caravans. They raided Abbasid territory. They threatened Iraq. And then, in the year 930, they did something that shocked the Muslim world. They attacked Mecca during the pilgrimage season. Pilgrims were killed. The sacred sanctuary was violated, and the black stone of the Kaaba was removed. For the Abbasid Caliph, the humiliation was enormous. The man who claimed leadership of the Muslim world could not protect Islam's holiest sanctuary. The black stone remained outside Mecca for more than 20 years before it was finally returned. But by then, an even greater challenge had appeared. In North Africa, another dynasty had declared that the Abbasids were not the rightful caliphs at all. The Fatimids, The Fatimids were Ismaili Shia Muslims. They claimed descent through Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, and her husband Ali. In the year 909, their ruler openly claimed the title of Caliph. This was different from an independent governor. The Fatimids were not saying, "We rule our territory," while recognizing Baghdad. They were saying, Baghdad's Caliph is not the true Caliph. For the first time, the Abbasids faced a rival dynasty controlling major territory and claiming universal leadership of the Muslim community. Then, in the year 969, the Fatimids conquered Egypt. They founded a new capital, Cairo. And from there, the Fatimid Caliphate became one of the great powers of the medieval Islamic world. Now there were rival caliphs, one in Baghdad, one in Cairo. And in Al-Andalus, the descendants of the Umayyads would soon claim the caliphal title as well. The unified caliphate of earlier centuries was gone. But the greatest humiliation for the Abbasids had not yet arrived. Because in the mountains south of the Caspian Sea, 3 brothers were building another dynasty. They came from Dalam. They were military leaders, and their family would become known as the Umayyads. The Umayyads expanded through Iran. They captured major cities. Their armies grew stronger, and by the middle of the 10th century, Baghdad was politically weak, financially unstable, and filled with rival military factions. The Caliph still possessed the title, but he did not possess an army capable of stopping what was coming. In the year 945, the Buyid ruler Ahmad ibn Buya entered Baghdad. There was no destruction like the Mongol invasion centuries later. The Abbasid dynasty was not abolished. The Caliph was allowed to remain. And that was precisely what made the moment so important. Because from now on, the man sitting on the Abbasid throne could remain Caliph, while another man controlled the army, the government, and the city around him. The Umayyads took political power. The Abbasids kept religious prestige. The old empire had reached a strange new stage. The Caliph had once ruled commanders. Then commanders had influenced caliphs. Now, commanders could rule the state, while the Caliph watched from his palace. The Abbasid Empire, in the political sense, was disappearing. But the Abbasid Caliphate itself would survive. And that distinction would allow the dynasty to endure for another 300 years. In the year 945, the Umayyads entered Baghdad. They did not destroy the Abbasid Caliphate. They discovered something far more useful. They could control it. For almost 200 years, the Abbasid caliphs had stood at the center of political power. Their ancestors had commanded armies, appointed governors, collected taxes across enormous territories, and removed anyone powerful enough to threaten the throne. Now, the situation had been reversed. The Umayyads controlled the soldiers. They controlled much of the government, and they controlled Baghdad itself. The Abbasid Caliph remained in his palace, but another dynasty possessed the power outside it. This created one of the strangest political arrangements in Abbasid history. The Umayyads were Shia Muslims. The Abbasid Caliph represented Sunni authority. Yet the Umayyads did not abolish him, because even without an empire, the Abbasid name still mattered. Across much of the Sunni Muslim world, the Caliph remained a powerful symbol of legitimacy. A ruler could possess an army. He could possess territory. He could possess money. But recognition from the Abbasid Caliph could give his rule something more: legitimacy. And so the Bumayyads kept the institution alive. The Caliph retained his title. Religious prestige remained attached to his position. But the real balance of political and military power had shifted decisively toward the Bumayyad rulers. This did not mean Baghdad suddenly collapsed. Far from it. The city remained one of the great intellectual and commercial centers of the Islamic world. Scholars still traveled there. Books were still written. Merchants still filled its markets. Mosques, libraries, and institutions of learning remained active. And some Bumayyad rulers became important patrons of the city themselves. The most famous was Adud al-Dawla. Under him, the Bumayyad realm reached one of its strongest periods. He sponsored construction, supported scholars, improved infrastructure, and established one of Baghdad's most famous hospitals, the Adudi Hospital. The political empire of the early Abbasids had weakened, but the civilization that had grown beneath them was still alive. In fact, some of the greatest thinkers associated with medieval Islamic civilization lived during the centuries when Abbasid political power was already declining. This is important. The Golden Age did not suddenly end because the Caliph lost direct control of Egypt, Iran, or Central Asia. Political fragmentation sometimes created new centers of patronage. Instead of one court supporting scholars, there were now many. Baghdad remained important, but so did Cairo, Bukhara, Ray, Isfahan, Nishapur, Damascus, and cities far beyond direct Abbasid rule. The Abbasids had lost an empire, but Islamic civilization had become larger than the empire that created it. Still, for the Caliphs themselves, the loss of power could be humiliating. Bumayyad rulers could influence succession. They could remove Caliphs. They could appoint another member of the Abbasid family. The title remained impressive. The reality behind it could be painfully weak. And outside Baghdad, rival caliphs were challenging even that title. In Cairo, the Fatimid caliphs claimed leadership over the Muslim world. Far to the west, the Umayyad ruler of Cordoba had also claimed the title of Caliph. There was no longer one universally recognized political center. Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba. 3 capitals, 3 dynasties, and 3 competing claims to the Caliphate. For an institution that had once claimed leadership from the Atlantic to Central Asia, the transformation was extraordinary. But history was about to change again. Far to the east, another people had entered the Islamic political world. The Seljuk Turks. The Seljuks came from Turkic nomadic origins in Central Asia. After converting to Islam, their leaders expanded rapidly across the eastern Islamic lands. In the year 1040, they defeated the powerful Ghaznavids at the Battle of Dandanakan. From there, their power spread across Iran. Their greatest early leader was Tughril Beg, and Tughril was moving west, toward Baghdad. For the Abbasid Caliph, the arrival of the Seljuks offered something he had not possessed for generations: a powerful Sunni military ally. The Bumayyads had controlled Baghdad for more than a century, but by the middle of the 11th century, their power was weakening. Internal rivalries had divided the dynasty. The military position was deteriorating, and the Seljuks were becoming the dominant force in Iran. Then, in the year 1055, Tughril entered Baghdad. Bumayyad rule in the city came to an end. The Abbasid Caliph remained, but his new protector was now the Seljuk ruler. Once again, the dynasty controlling Baghdad had changed, but the Abbasids had survived. The Caliph recognized Tugrul's authority, and the Seljuk ruler increasingly carried the title Sultan. The distinction became important. The Caliph represented religious and dynastic legitimacy. The Sultan possessed the army. The Caliph represented continuity. The Sultan exercised political power. Two forms of authority existing beside one another. But even this arrangement nearly collapsed. Only a few years after Tugrul entered Baghdad, a Turkish commander named al-Basasiri rebelled against Seljuk power. And behind him stood the greatest rival of the Abbasid Caliphate, the Fatimids of Cairo. In the year 1058, while Tugrul was occupied elsewhere, al-Basasiri entered Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliph, al-Qa'im, was forced from the city. And for a brief period, the name of the Fatimid Caliph was proclaimed in Baghdad itself. Think about what that meant. The city founded by the Abbasids, the city that had represented their dynasty for almost 300 years, was now recognizing their greatest rival. For a moment, it appeared that the Abbasid Caliphate might finally disappear. But Tugrul returned. Al-Basasiri's position collapsed. He was defeated and killed, and al-Qa'im returned to Baghdad. Once again, the Abbasid dynasty survived. It had survived the Umayyads. It had survived civil war. It had survived the soldiers of Samarra. It had survived the Umayyads. And now, it had survived an attempt to replace its authority with that of the Fatimids. But survival came with dependence. The Seljuk sultans were now the great military power of the Eastern Muslim world. They controlled Iran, Iraq, and eventually enormous territories extending toward Central Asia and Anatolia. And in 1071, a Seljuk army under Sultan Alp Arslan defeated the Byzantine emperor at the Battle of Manzikert. The victory accelerated Turkic expansion into Anatolia and transformed the balance of power between the Islamic world and Byzantium. Yet the Abbasid Caliph did not command the army that won at Manzikert. The Seljuk Sultan did. The distinction between symbolic authority and military power had become permanent. Then, at the end of the 11th century, another force arrived from the west. The Crusaders. In 1095, Pope Urban II called Christians in Western Europe to take up arms and travel east. 4 years later, Crusader armies captured Jerusalem. The event shocked the Muslim world. But there was no single unified Abbasid army capable of responding. The region was divided among Seljuk rulers, local governors, rival dynasties, and competing military commanders. The Caliph in Baghdad possessed prestige, but prestige alone could not reconquer Jerusalem. The military struggle against the Crusader states would instead be led over the following generations by regional rulers, men such as Zengi, Nur al-Din, and eventually Salah al-Din. Saladin. And yet, even Saladin understood the value of the Abbasid name. When he ended Fatimid rule in Egypt in 1171, the Abbasid Caliph was once again acknowledged there. More than 2 centuries after Egypt had escaped direct Abbasid government, the Abbasids had regained something they had almost lost forever. Not the province itself, but recognition. That was the strange power of the late Abbasid Caliphate. Its armies could be weak, its territory could be small, its rulers could depend upon stronger men. And still, The Abbasid title survived. Dynasties rose, dynasties collapsed. Umayyads disappeared, Seljuks fragmented. Fatimid rule eventually ended, but the descendants of al-Abbas were still sitting in Baghdad. And then something unexpected happened. As Seljuk power weakened during the 12th century, the Abbasid Caliphs began recovering political independence. For generations, they had lived beneath the protection of stronger rulers. Now, some caliphs began rebuilding armies of their own. They fought for territory, they challenged Seljuk control, and slowly, direct Abbasid authority returned across parts of Iraq. In 1157, Seljuk forces even besieged Baghdad. But this time, the city did not fall. The Abbasids survived the siege, and the Caliphate entered a modest political revival. The old empire stretching across continents was never restored. That age was gone forever. But for the first time in centuries, the Caliph of Baghdad could again become more than a figurehead. And near the end of the 12th century, one Abbasid ruler would push that revival further than almost anyone expected. His name was al-Nasir. He would rule for more than 40 years. He would attempt to rebuild Abbasid authority, navigate the world of Saladin and his successors, and strengthen Baghdad at a moment when the Caliphate appeared to have survived its greatest dangers. But far beyond the eastern borders of the Islamic world, a new empire was being born. An empire unlike the Umayyads, unlike the Seljuks, unlike the Crusaders. Its armies would cross Central Asia, destroy cities that had stood for centuries, and eventually reach the walls of Baghdad itself. The Abbasids had survived nearly everything. They would not survive the Mongols. By the time al-Nasir became Caliph in the year 1180, the empire of Harun al-Rashid was already a distant memory. Egypt had its own rulers. Syria was divided among powerful dynasties. Iran had passed through the hands of Seljuks and regional warlords, and across much of the Muslim world, the Abbasid Caliph possessed influence, but not direct control. Yet something unusual happened during al-Nasir's reign. After centuries of losing power, the Abbasids began taking some of it back. Al-Nasir would remain on the throne for more than 40 years, from 1180 until 1225. It would become one of the longest reigns in Abbasid history. And he was not content to remain a ceremonial ruler. The Seljuk Empire, which had once dominated Baghdad, was breaking apart. Different branches of the Seljuk family fought one another. Regional rulers competed for territory, and the political system that had kept the Caliph beneath the authority of powerful sultans was weakening. Al-Nasir saw an opportunity. He strengthened Abbasid control across Iraq. He became involved in struggles beyond its borders. He used diplomacy, alliances, religious authority, and when necessary, military force. For the first time in generations, the Caliph of Baghdad was again acting as an independent political ruler. Cambridge describes his reign as the point at which long-running Abbasid attempts to restore authority finally achieved significant success. Al-Nasir also tried to strengthen something that armies alone could not provide. The idea that the Abbasid Caliph stood at the center of the Muslim world. He associated himself with religious networks, Sufi figures, and groups connected with a tradition known as Futuwa. Futuwa could involve ideas of brotherhood, discipline, generosity, loyalty, and moral conduct. Al-Nasir attempted to bring such networks under caliphal patronage, using them to extend the symbolic influence of Baghdad far beyond the territory he directly controlled. It was a different kind of power. Harun al-Rashid had ruled an empire. Al-Nasir ruled a much smaller state. But he wanted rulers far beyond Iraq to remember that the Abbasid Caliphs still mattered. And for a time, it worked. But to the east, another empire was becoming dangerously powerful. The Khwarezmian Empire. Its ruler, Muhammad II, had expanded across enormous territories in Iran and Central Asia. As his power grew, so did his conflict with Baghdad. Muhammad wanted political recognition that al-Nasir was unwilling to give him. Eventually, their rivalry became so bitter that Muhammad challenged the Abbasid Caliph's position itself. In 1217, the Khwarezm Shah marched west, intending to confront Baghdad. For the first time in generations, an eastern conqueror appeared capable of ending the Abbasid revival almost as soon as it had begun. But Muhammad never reached the city. His campaign across the mountains was struck by severe winter conditions, and the advance collapsed. Baghdad survived. Al-Nasir appeared to have escaped one of the greatest threats of his reign. But neither he nor Muhammad could yet understand what was happening much farther east. Beyond the lands of the Khwarezm Shah, the tribes of Mongolia had been united beneath one ruler. His name was Temujin. History would remember him as Genghis Khan. In 1206, Genghis Khan had been proclaimed supreme ruler of the Mongols. What followed was one of the most extraordinary expansions in human history. Mongol armies moved across northern China, the steppe, and Central Asia. They traveled quickly. They coordinated armies across enormous distances. They used intelligence, discipline, mobility, and siege specialists recruited from conquered peoples. Cities that resisted could face catastrophic destruction. Cities that surrendered might be incorporated into the growing empire. And eventually, the Mongols reached the borders of Khwarezm. The confrontation that followed changed the history of the entire region. Between 1219 and 1221, Genghis Khan's armies invaded the Khwarezmian Empire. Bukhara fell, Samarkand fell. Cities across Central Asia and Iran were attacked. The empire that had recently threatened Baghdad collapsed with astonishing speed. Muhammad II fled west, pursued by the Mongols. He eventually died, far from the imperial court from which he had once ruled. His son, Jalal al-Din, continued resisting. But the political world east of Baghdad had been transformed. A new power now existed in Asia, one far greater than the Khwarezm Shahs, the Mongols. Yet Baghdad itself was not attacked. Genghis Khan's armies devastated territories across the east, but they stopped short of conquering the Abbasid capital during al-Nasir's lifetime. And in 1225, after more than 4 decades on the throne, al-Nasir died. The Abbasid dynasty had survived again. But now, a new danger existed on the horizon. Al-Nasir's son, al-Zahir, became caliph. His reign lasted less than a year. Then, in 1226, the throne passed to his son, al-Mustansir. And under al-Mustansir, Baghdad experienced one final period of stability before the disaster to come. The city was no longer the capital of an empire stretching from North Africa to Central Asia, but it was still Baghdad, a great city of merchants scholars, mosques, markets, schools, and books. People still traveled there to study. Government institutions still functioned. The Abbasid court still possessed wealth, and the Caliphs still commanded direct territory centered on Iraq. Then, in 1233, al-Mustansir founded one of the most famous institutions of late Abbasid Baghdad, the Mustansiriya. It was an elite madrasa built beside the Tigris. Students studied Islamic law, Arabic, religious sciences, and other subjects. Unlike many institutions associated with one particular Sunni school of law, the Mustansiriya provided places for students from all four major Sunni legal schools. Cambridge's History of the Abbasids notes that the institution was designed for 248 students, 62 from each school. Think about what this represented. Almost 500 years after the Abbasid Revolution, Baghdad was still building institutions of learning. The dynasty was old. Its empire had fragmented. Its political power had risen, fallen, and risen again. Yet the intellectual life of the city had not disappeared. There was no obvious sign, standing beside the Tigris, that within only 25 years, the dynasty's rule in Baghdad would be gone. Al-Mustansir died in 1242. His son succeeded him. His name was Al-Mustasim. He would become the 37th Abbasid Caliph and the final Abbasid Caliph to rule from Baghdad. When Al-Mustasim came to power, the Mongols were still far from Baghdad, but the world around the Abbasids was becoming increasingly dangerous. Genghis Khan had died years earlier, but his empire had not disappeared with him. His sons, grandsons, and generals continued the expansion. Mongol armies moved into Russia. Eastern Europe was invaded. Iran remained beneath Mongol pressure, and different branches of Genghis Khan's family ruled territories stretching across Eurasia. Then, in 1251, Möngke became Great Khan of the Mongol Empire. He intended to push Mongol power even farther. One brother would continue the conquest of China. Another brother would be sent west. His name was Hulagu. Hulagu Khan was another grandson of Genghis Khan. And the army assembled for his western campaign was not merely a force of Mongol horsemen. It included troops and specialists drawn from across the empire, engineers, siege experts, Chinese units, and forces supplied by Mongol allies and subject peoples. This army was designed to conquer cities. Before Baghdad, Hulagu had another target: the Nizari Ismailis. For generations, the Nizaris had controlled a network of heavily defended mountain fortresses across Iran. Their enemies in medieval Europe would later become famous for calling them the Assassins. Their strongholds had resisted much larger powers, but in 1256, Hulagu's campaign broke the power of the Nizari state. Fortresses surrendered, Al-Amin fell into Mongol hands, and another barrier between the Mongols and Iraq had disappeared. Now, Hulagu turned toward Baghdad. The Abbasid court faced a threat unlike anything it had confronted before. The Bumayyads had wanted to control the Caliph. The Seljuks had wanted his legitimacy. Regional dynasties had wanted independence. Hulagu did not need any of those things. The Mongols demanded submission. And by the late 1250s, the political situation in Baghdad was deeply dangerous. Al-Mustasim possessed neither the empire of Al-Mansur nor the armies of Harun al-Rashid. The Abbasid state still controlled Baghdad and surrounding territory, but compared with the forces Hulagu could assemble, its military resources were limited. Diplomacy now mattered more than ever. Messages traveled between Hulagu and the Abbasid court. The Mongol commander demanded obedience. The negotiations failed, and the danger moved closer. In the final months of 1257, Hulagu prepared his armies for the invasion of Iraq. Forces approached from different directions, designed to prevent Baghdad from escaping the encirclement. The city that had survived civil wars, rebellions, Umayyads, Seljuks, and centuries of political collapse was running out of time. Inside Baghdad, life continued. The markets opened. Students studied. The call to prayer crossed the city. Boats traveled along the Tigris. The Abbasid Caliph still sat on a throne whose history reached back more than 500 years. But beyond the eastern horizon, an army was coming. An army whose commanders had watched cities resist them before, and they knew exactly how to destroy one. In January of 1258, the Mongols reached Baghdad. They surrounded the city. They prepared their siege engines. They cut off escape routes. And after more than 5 centuries, the Abbasid dynasty had reached the moment we saw at the beginning of this story. The black banners still flew. The Caliph was still inside his palace. Baghdad was still standing, but not for much longer. In January of 1258, Hulagu Khan's armies reached Baghdad. For more than 500 years, the Abbasid dynasty had survived rebellion, civil war, foreign domination, and the collapse of the empire it had once ruled. But the enemy now surrounding Baghdad was different. The Mongols had already destroyed kingdoms across Asia. They had conquered cities thought to be untouchable. And Hulagu had brought with him an army specifically prepared for siege warfare. Horsemen surrounded the countryside. Engineers prepared siege machines. Routes out of Baghdad were blocked. The Abbasid capital was being sealed shut. Inside the city, Caliph al-Mustasim faced the greatest crisis of his reign. He had inherited one of the most prestigious titles in the Muslim world, but prestige was not an army. The Abbasids no longer possessed the military power of their ancestors. There was no vast imperial force waiting in Khorasan, no Harun al-Rashid commanding armies across the frontier, no al-Mansur rebuilding the state. The empire had disappeared centuries earlier. What remained was Baghdad, parts of Iraq, and the ancient authority of the Abbasid name. Against Hulagu, it was not enough. The Mongols approached Baghdad from more than one direction. Abbasid forces attempted to resist outside the city, but they were defeated. Some troops were trapped when Mongol forces manipulated canals and flooded parts of the surrounding land. Many were killed. Others fled back toward Baghdad. Then the siege began. Mongol engineers moved their machines into position. Stones crashed against the fortifications. Arrows and projectiles passed over the walls. Defenders tried to answer from inside. But the Mongols had done this before. They had learned siege warfare from the civilizations they conquered. Chinese, Persian, and other engineers served within their armies. The Mongol military was no longer simply an army of horsemen from the steppe. It had become an imperial war machine, capable of destroying fortified cities. Within days, Baghdad's position became hopeless. The walls could not hold forever, There was no major relief army coming, and negotiations had failed to stop the invasion. Al-Mustasim finally agreed to surrender. In February, the Abbasid Caliph left Baghdad and entered Hulagu's camp. The dynasty that had once received ambassadors from distant kings was now standing before a Mongol conqueror asking for mercy. It did not save the city. Mongol forces entered Baghdad. What followed became one of the most infamous events in medieval Islamic history. Large parts of the population were killed, buildings were destroyed, palaces were looted, religious institutions, homes, markets, and centers of learning were damaged or lost. Medieval writers later gave enormous numbers for those who died. The exact number cannot be known. But the destruction itself was real and immense. For generations, Baghdad had represented knowledge. Books had been copied there, scholars had debated there, physicians had worked there, mathematicians had written there. Later stories would claim that so many books were thrown into the Tigris that the river ran black with ink. That image became one of the most famous legends of the sack. Whether every detail of those later accounts is literal or not, the symbolism survived for a reason. To later generations, the fall of Baghdad represented more than the destruction of buildings. It represented the destruction of a world. The Abbasid Caliph himself was taken prisoner. Al-Mustasim would not survive. Sources disagree about the exact method of his execution. Later traditions famously claimed that he was wrapped in a carpet and killed beneath the hooves of horses, so that royal blood would not touch the ground. Other accounts describe his death differently, but on one fact there is no disagreement. Al-Mustasim was killed. The last Abbasid Caliph to rule Baghdad was dead. Nearly 5 centuries earlier, Abu Muslim had raised black banners in Khorasan. Those banners had travelled west. They had defeated the Umayyads. They had brought Abu al-Abbas to the throne. Al-Mansur had built Baghdad. Harun al-Rashid had ruled during its age of legendary wealth. Al-Ma'mun had patronized scholars and translators. The Abbasids had survived brothers killing brothers, soldiers controlling caliphs, provinces breaking away, Umayyads taking Baghdad, Seljuks ruling beside them, and rival Caliphates challenging their legitimacy. Again and again, the dynasty survived, until 1258. For the first time since Baghdad had been founded, there was no Abbasid Caliph ruling from the city. And yet, this was not quite the end of the Abbasid name. A few years later, surviving members of the Abbasid family appeared in Egypt. There, under the protection of the Mamluk rulers of Cairo, an Abbasid line of caliphs was established. They did not possess the empire of their ancestors. They did not rule Baghdad, and real political power remained with the Mamluk sultans. But the Abbasid title survived. For centuries more, the name continued. Still, the great age of Abbasid political power had ended on the banks of the Tigris. But an empire should not be judged only by the day it falls. Because the Abbasids had changed the world long before the Mongols reached Baghdad. They had shifted the center of the Muslim world eastward. They had built one of history's greatest cities. They had connected Mediterranean, Persian, Indian, and Central Asian intellectual traditions. Under their rule, Arabic became one of the great languages of global scholarship. Mathematicians developed algebra, astronomers measured and mapped the heavens, Physicians produced medical works studied for generations. Translators preserved and transformed knowledge inherited from earlier civilizations. And scholars of Quran, Hadith, law, language, and theology built traditions that continue to influence Muslims today. The Abbasids did not create all of this alone. Their civilization included Arabs, Persians, Turks, Central Asians, Christians, Jews, Muslims, and scholars from countless backgrounds. That was precisely its strength. Baghdad became great because knowledge could travel there from almost anywhere. And what ended Baghdad could leave changed. The dynasty itself had risen through revolution. It reached extraordinary heights, then slowly, over centuries, its political power slipped away. But the world it helped create outlived it. The Mongols could conquer Baghdad. They could end Abbasid rule in the city. But they could not erase the mathematics, the books, the institutions, the scholarship, or the ideas that had already traveled far beyond its walls. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part of the Abbasid story. An empire that began beneath black banners, built a city at the center of the medieval world, lost almost everything it once controlled, and still survived for more than 500 years. From the revolution in Khorasan to the round city of Al-Mansur, from Harun al-Rashid to the scholars of Baghdad, from civil war to military domination, and finally to the Mongols at the gates. This was the story of the Abbasid Caliphate.